Econ kids, this is Module 18, looking at aggregate supply and determining factors for aggregate supply. So in this section, you're going to talk about aggregate supply. It looks a lot like the supply in micro, right? So we have a line that looks like this, right? That's upward sloping. And over here we have price level, just like we did with demand. And then down the bottom, we have our real GDP. And as we're looking at that, real GDP and price level, then we have this right here is our aggregate supply. And when you think about it, it's sort of like the supply of everything, okay? Now, sometimes what you'll see here is this is our short run aggregate supply. You'll probably see it like that. And the reason you see it like that is because there's a long run aggregate supply as well. So when you look at short run aggregate supply, it's going to look like this. When you look at a long run aggregate supply, sometimes you'll see it, usually you see it drawn together. So you'll see this perfectly vertical line. And then up here, you'll see LRAS, which just means long run aggregate supply curve. And oftentimes you'll see it with a short run aggregate supply curve in here, just labeled AS. And then a lot of times you'll see it with an aggregate demand line in here like this, aggregate demand. And what it really means is this is what we can do if we were at like full employment. Okay, so a lot of times we'll put like a YF there. And then this is, again, real GDP. And over here, we're going to have price level. So long run aggregate supply, perfectly vertical here. And then aggregate supply is going to be upward sloping when it's in the short run. All right. So when you talk about the short run aggregate supply curve, what we're really talking about is like, hey, we're just showing you basically a line that says when the price of a unit of output is rising faster than the cost of producing that output, we're going to see this curve happen, right? The price is going up faster than I can make it. And if the price of everything is going up that fast, we're going to be dealing with probably inflated prices, okay? Now, the short run versus long run portion, that's really based off of our flexibility, in particular wages, all right? So when you think about this long run line in here, what's going to happen in the long run is if I could pay everybody, right, in terms of their wages, if I could pay you more when the good costs more, or was making more profit, and I could pay you less when I was getting less price for my good, then this line would be the only line that exists. But because wages are sticky, right, what's going to happen is I'm going to see the price go up on my good first, and then eventually I will see wages increase. So my aggregate supply in the short run might happen, like a movement might happen first, and then when you ask for a wage increase or something like that, it'll go back to my long run aggregate supply line. So we'll model that out in a little bit. Here is an example, strong economy and a weak economy. If you want to push pause and read through that, you certainly can. We're just not going to go through it here. When you're thinking about shifts in that short run aggregate supply curve, okay, things that shift the supply curve are going to be things that are pretty big items. So things that shift that are going to be things like oil prices. It's going to take something pretty major to move our curve here. It's not going to be like just everyday inputs. It has to be something that's going to affect lots and lots of things. So if this is my short run aggregate supply curve, if that's going to move like to the right, for example, I might see something like, I don't know, a decrease in the price of oil, or maybe we found some new oil someplace. And so now I'm going to have short run aggregate supply 2 over here because somehow things were easier for me to produce. When I look at something like that going up in terms of price, it's going to move the opposite direction. So for example, if all of a sudden steel prices increase, right, and it's harder for me to get, then I'm going to see the short run aggregate supply for lots of things move to the left because steel is in lots of things. Changes in nominal wages. If I see something like an increase in wages overall, it's going to shift supply, this short run supply to the left. And changes in productivity, right? Higher productivity, shifting it to the right. Lower productivity, shifting it to the left. So those are things that could shift the entire curve. And there you can see an example, just moving the curve to the right. There, it's just going to move to the curve to the left, just like we drew before. Okay, so now the long run aggregate supply curve. What's going to happen here? Well, if wages aren't sticky, then we don't have to worry. We would just have a long run aggregate supply curve in here. Okay, so in this case, well, that was a bad idea. In this case, we're going to have something that looks like this, right? So I have my aggregate supply here. I got my long run aggregate supply here. Okay. But if my wages could just go up, like I said before, whenever I want them to, or down whenever I want, this is what would happen. But instead, what's going to happen is some factors are going to like kind of kick over here to my short run. And then when my short run shifts, it's going to go back to my long run. And we're going to show that process. Now, does this long run ever change? I would say be very cautious when you decide to move this long run aggregate supply curve. Almost always, it's not going to be the case. Like it's going to be a movement of your aggregate supply back and forth, which will then get us to a different point on our long run aggregate supply curve. But the long run aggregate supply curve pretty much stays in one spot. If in a question it tells you one of these three factors over here on the side here, like technology, a more educated workforce, or increase in resources, then we might see this long run aggregate supply curve like move over. So we might see something like this, right? But that means our entire economy had some fundamental change that caused us at full employment to be able to produce more. So that's a pretty big deal. It would have to be some sort of like the internet. When that happened, yes, our long run aggregate supply curve shifted to the right because now we are able to produce more of everything and quicker and just making everything quicker. Let's put it that way, communication wise, and then getting it to places. So how does this go from short run to long run? What's going to happen? The price increased. All right. So we're going to see this price change. All right. And then when that price changes, we're going to end up seeing we're going to end up seeing a movement to a different point on our short run aggregate supply curve. Okay. So when I see price go up here, so here's my short run curve. Here's my long run curve. And now my price changed. So now my price on everything went up to here. Okay. So maybe it's because there's a demand line in here. When that happens, I now am beyond maybe my full employment up here. Okay. At Y1. So people all have jobs, right? Like maybe this is 5%, 4%, something like unemployment. Here, we're dealing with like 3% unemployment. And what we saw was a price increase, right? On literally everything. So we went from P1 to P2 at my price level. So that means I'm dealing with some inflation. So as I deal with some inflation here, eventually what's going to happen is you aren't going to have any enough money, right? Because the goods are too expensive and you have a job. And so you're going to go to your boss and be like, hey, I need a raise. And your boss is going to say, yeah, I probably have to give you a raise because there's hardly any workers out here and you're pretty good at your job. So when that boss gives you a raise, now all of a sudden that aggregate supply is going to shift back to the left a little bit because now the workers are more expensive. All right. So in this process, we went from P1 to P2, and then because I got rid of some workers and you got a wage increase, I am actually back here on my long run aggregate supply curve and we're at P3. So did you see inflation happen? Yes, you did. But here's the thing. You have a job and you have a raise. So because of those factors, where you have a job and a raise, you aren't too worried that this inflation happened. So that's the whole process of seeing this aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. So, or short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. Now, the other thing that would happen is there's probably a demand curve in here like this, our aggregate demand. So you're really seeing P1 here, right? A shift over here to this new aggregate supply. And then because we gave you a raise, etc., pushed it back here, and now we're at a new point on our aggregate supply curve. In terms of our new aggregate supply curve, a new point on our long run aggregate supply curve, but it's really just, going back to the beginning where it originally was. So that can happen in reverse too. If you look up here, we're not going to draw this one, but your short run aggregate supply, we saw maybe the price go down. Then what happens? More people, maybe you're in a recession, people are going to take less wages because they really want a job. So then short run aggregate supply shifts to the right because we're hiring more people. And then the price is going to come down right back to our long run aggregate supply line, and we're back at full employment. That's the whole idea behind module 18, and it's going to be like this, moving on your aggregate supply curve to your long run aggregate supply curve. But it basically all happens because wages are sticky, and you're going to have to go through this process of moving around your short run aggregate supply to then get us back to that long run aggregate supply at full employment. All right, till next time.